Jonathan Hayes had always dreamed of a quiet life. After decades of working long hours in the construction industry, he finally saved enough to buy his own piece of paradise, a sprawling plot of land at the edge of a suburban neighborhood. The property was perfect, surrounded by tall trees that swayed gently in the breeze, dotted with patches of wildflowers, and far enough from the main road to feel secluded yet close enough to stay connected. It wasn't extravagant, but it was his, a reward for years of hard work. Every morning, Jonathan would sip his coffee on the porch, listening to birds chirp and watching deer wander through the woods behind his house. He loved the simplicity of it all. His neighbors were friendly enough, though most lived closer to the heart of the development where houses stood side by side like soldiers in formation. Jonathan preferred his solitude. That's why he chose this particular lot. It offered him space, freedom, and a sense of independence. But there was one thing about living here that Jonathan hadn't fully considered when he bought the land: the Homeowners Association, or HOA. At first, their rules seemed harmless. Keep your lawn trimmed, don't leave trash cans out too long, paint your mailbox white if you replace it. Nothing too extreme. But over time, Jonathan noticed how controlling they could be. They fined people for planting flowers outside approved color palettes. They argued over holiday decorations being up too early or too late. And worst of all, they expected everyone to attend monthly meetings, which Jonathan found pointless and boring. Jonathan decided early on that he didn't want any part of the HOA. He paid his taxes, maintained his property, and kept to himself. Why should he have to follow someone else's rigid guidelines? When an HOA representative knocked on his door one afternoon, asking him to join, Jonathan politely declined. "I'm happy doing things my way," he said with a smile. The representative nodded but left looking uneasy, as though Jonathan had committed some kind of crime. Little did Jonathan know, refusing the HOA would come back to haunt him. While he enjoyed his peaceful existence, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Some members of the HOA resented his independence. They saw him as a rebel who refused to play by their rules. Others whispered about how much land he owned and whether it was fair for one person to have so much space, while others struggled to find parking spots for their cars. These murmurs grew louder, feeding into frustration among the board members. What no one realized, not even Jonathan, was that these whispers would soon turn into action. Behind closed doors, the HOA began discussing ways to address the issue. Their solution: use an old zoning law buried deep in municipal records to claim part of Jonathan's property as communal space. To them, it seemed like a clever loophole. To Jonathan, it would become a nightmare. For now, however, life went on as usual. Jonathan continued tending to his garden, fixing up his shed, and enjoying quiet evenings under the stars. He had no idea that forces beyond his control were already setting plans in motion. Plans that would shatter the tranquility he cherished so deeply. It was a crisp autumn morning when Jonathan returned home after a weekend fishing trip, the kind of day where the air feels fresh and the world seems quiet. He drove down his gravel driveway, humming along to the radio, looking forward to relaxing in his favorite chair with a cup of hot tea. But as he rounded the last curve, his truck screeched to a halt. His jaw dropped, and his heart sank. There on his land, his beautiful, untouched land, stood 12 gray garages. They were lined up like soldiers in formation, cold and impersonal, completely out of place among the trees and wildflowers. Jonathan blinked, thinking maybe he was imagining things, but no, they were real. Each structure was identical: small doors, no windows, and painted in the same dull shade of gray that seemed to suck the life out of everything around it. Jonathan stepped out of his truck, his boots crunching against the gravel as he walked closer to inspect the damage. The garages stretched across nearly half of his property, blocking the view of the woods and ruining the natural beauty he had worked so hard to preserve. How could this have happened? Who would dare do something like this? His mind raced as he tried to piece together what might have gone wrong. Then it hit him: the HOA. It had to be them. No one else would have the audacity or the resources to build something this large without permission. Jonathan clenched his fists, anger bubbling inside him. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a blatant invasion of his private property. The next day, Jonathan marched into the HOA's office, determined to get answers. The room fell silent as he entered, his presence commanding attention. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, slamming a photo of the garages onto the table in front of the board members. One of them, a smug man named Richard, leaned back in his chair and smirked. "We needed more parking space for residents," Richard explained casually, as if building structures on someone else's land was the most normal thing in the world. "Your lot was underutilized, and we found some old zoning laws that allowed us to make use of it." "Make use of it," Jonathan repeated, incredulous. "This is my property. You can't just take it because you feel like it." Richard shrugged, unfazed by Jonathan's outrage. "Technically, according to those laws, it belongs to the community now. We're doing everyone a favor." Favor? Jonathan couldn't believe what he was hearing. These people weren't helping anyone. They were stealing from him. He argued, pleaded, and even threatened legal action, but the HOA remained unmoved. They acted as though they were untouchable, confident that their fine print and fancy lawyers would protect them. As Jonathan left the meeting, frustration burned in his chest. He felt powerless, outnumbered, and betrayed. This wasn't just about the garages anymore. It was about principle. His land was his sanctuary, his reward for years of hard work, and these people had trampled all over it without a second thought. Standing in his yard later that evening, staring at the ugly structures that now dominated his once pristine property, Jonathan made a silent vow. He wouldn't let them win. Somehow, someway, he would fight back. And he wouldn't stop until every single one of those garages was gone. Jonathan knew he couldn't just sit back and let the HOA get away with what they had done. The garages were an eyesore, yes, but more than that, they represented something much bigger, a blatant disregard for his rights as a property owner. He wasn't about to roll over and accept defeat. Instead, he decided to take the fight to them, starting with the law. The first step was hiring a lawyer. Jonathan spent hours researching attorneys who specialized in property disputes, finally settling on a seasoned professional named Margaret Lane. She came highly recommended, known for her sharp mind and relentless determination. When they met for the first time, Jonathan laid out everything: the invasion of his land, the HOA's smug attitude, and their claim that some obscure zoning law gave them the right to build on his property. Margaret listened carefully, nodding as she flipped through the documents Jonathan brought with him. "This is going to be tricky," she admitted after a long pause. "The HOA has deep pockets, and they'll drag this out as long as possible. But we have a solid case. Let's see what we can do." Over the next several months, Jonathan found himself caught in a whirlwind of legal battles. There were endless phone calls, stacks of paperwork, and meetings that seemed to go nowhere. Every time he thought they were making progress, another roadblock appeared. The HOA countered every move they made, citing technicalities and loopholes that only prolonged the process. It felt like they were playing a game, one where the rules kept changing to suit them. To make matters worse, the costs began piling up. Filing fees, court appearances, expert witnesses, it all added up quickly. Jonathan had saved money for retirement, not for a legal war, and he watched with growing unease as his savings dwindled. Still, he refused to give up. This wasn't just about money. It was about justice. He couldn't let the HOA win, no matter how hard they tried to wear him down. As winter approached, Jonathan grew increasingly frustrated. The garages still stood on his land, mocking him every time he looked at them. Neighbors whispered behind his back, some sympathizing with his plight, while others sided with the HOA, claiming he was being unreasonable. Even Margaret started sounding less optimistic during their meetings. "They're stalling," she told him one afternoon. "They know how expensive this is for you. They're hoping you'll run out of steam or funds. Jonathan left that meeting feeling defeated, but also more determined than ever. He realized that relying solely on the legal system might not be enough. If the HOA could twist laws to their advantage, then maybe he needed to think outside the box too. Sitting in his truck afterward, staring at the garages bathed in the pale light of a winter sunset, an idea began to form in his mind. What if there was another way? What if instead of waiting for the courts to decide, he took matters into his own hands? After all, those garages didn't belong there. They were built illegally without his permission, and they were destroying his peace. Maybe it was time to send a message loud and clear. No one messed with Jonathan Hayes, not even the mighty HOA. That night, unable to sleep, Jonathan sat at his kitchen table sketching plans and jotting down notes. For the first time in months, he felt a spark of hope. If the law wouldn't help him reclaim his land, then perhaps action would. And so, quietly and methodically, Jonathan began laying the groundwork for a plan that would change everything. For him, for the HOA, and for the entire neighborhood. Jonathan's frustration had reached its boiling point. The legal battle was draining him, not just financially, but emotionally. Every day felt like a punch to the gut, and every setback made the HOA seem even more untouchable. But instead of letting despair consume him, Jonathan decided it was time to take control. He wasn't going to wait around for someone else to fix this mess. If the system wouldn't help him, he'd find another way. The idea came to him one sleepless night as he stared at the ceiling, replaying every insult, every smug comment from the HOA board in his mind. Those garages didn't belong on his land. They were built illegally without his consent, and they stood as symbols of arrogance and greed. Why should he tolerate them any longer? What if he could remove them himself? It sounded crazy, but the more Jonathan thought about it, the more it made sense. After all, who better to dismantle something than the man who knew how to build it? The next morning, Jonathan called up some old friends and colleagues from his construction days. These were people he trusted, hard-working individuals who understood what it meant to stand your ground. When he explained the situation, their reactions varied. Some laughed, thinking he was joking. Others hesitated, worried about potential consequences. But when Jonathan laid out his plan in detail, showing them sketches and timelines, they couldn't resist the challenge. By the end of the week, he had assembled a small but capable crew ready to take on the impossible. Together, they mapped out every step of the operation. Timing was everything. They needed to act quickly, efficiently, and under the radar to avoid drawing attention from the HOA or local authorities. Jonathan spent hours calculating how long it would take to bring down each garage, factoring in tools, manpower, and cleanup. He even planned escape routes in case things went sideways. Nothing was left to chance. To stay organized, Jonathan created schedules and assigned roles. One team would handle demolition, using sledgehammers and crowbars to break through walls. Another group would operate heavy machinery, hauling away debris and flattening the structures. A third team focused on logistics, keeping watch for nosy neighbors, managing noise levels, and ensuring no evidence was left behind. Everyone knew exactly what they had to do, and they worked together like a well-oiled machine. But Jonathan didn't stop there. Knowing the HOA would try to retaliate, he gathered documentation to protect himself. He took photos of the garages, noting their poor construction quality and lack of proper permits. He saved copies of emails, letters, and legal filings, proving that the HOA had acted unlawfully. If anyone accused him of vandalism or trespassing, he'd have proof that those structures never should have been there in the first place. As the plan came together, Jonathan felt a renewed sense of purpose. For months, he had felt powerless, trapped in a system rigged against him. Now he was taking charge, reclaiming not just his property but his dignity. This wasn't just about tearing down buildings. It was about standing up to bullies and showing them that they couldn't walk all over him. On the eve of the operation, Jonathan met with his crew at a nearby diner to go over the final details. The air buzzed with excitement and nervous energy. "We're doing this for ourselves," Jonathan said firmly, looking each person in the eye. "For fairness, for justice, and most importantly, for peace." By the time they finished their meal, the sun had set, casting the world in shadow. Tomorrow would be a new day, and the beginning of something extraordinary. The clock struck midnight, and the neighborhood was cloaked in darkness. Most residents were fast asleep, unaware of what was about to unfold just a few hundred yards away. Jonathan and his crew moved like shadows, their boots crunching softly against the gravel as they approached the garages. The air was chilly, but adrenaline coursed through their veins, keeping them warm and focused. This was it, the moment they had been planning for weeks. Jonathan stood at the edge of his property, surveying the scene. 12 gray garages loomed ahead, their cold, lifeless forms standing as reminders of the HOA's overreach. But not for long. With a deep breath, he signaled for the team to begin. Instantly, the quiet night erupted into controlled chaos. One group sprang into action, wielding sledgehammers and crowbars. Metal clanged against metal as they broke through the garage doors, their strikes precise and deliberate. Another team fired up bulldozers, their engines growling low to avoid drawing too much attention. The machines roared to life, tearing into the structures with brute force. Dust filled the air, catching the faint glow of the moonlight, as chunks of concrete and steel crumbled to the ground. Despite the noise, the operation remained stealthy. Neighbors occasionally stirred, peeking through curtains or stepping onto porches to investigate the commotion. But by the time anyone realized what was happening, the crew was already halfway done. Jonathan had stationed lookouts at key points around the property, ready to alert the team if anyone got too close. So far, everything was going according to plan. By sunrise, 6 of the garages were reduced to piles of rubble. The transformation was astonishing. Where there had once been rows of imposing structures, there was now open space, bathed in golden morning light. Jonathan wiped sweat from his brow and allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. They were ahead of schedule, but there was no time to celebrate. The second wave of demolition was about to begin. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, curiosity spread throughout the neighborhood. Some residents watched from afar, whispering among themselves. A few even snapped photos, unsure whether to cheer or call the authorities. Meanwhile, the HOA board scrambled to respond. Calls flooded their phones, demanding answers. Richard, the smug chairman, fumed when he arrived on site, only to find half the garages already gone. "This is outrageous," he shouted, storming toward Jonathan, who stood calmly amidst the debris. "You can't do this. You're destroying community property." Jonathan raised an eyebrow, unfazed by Richard's theatrics. "Community property," he replied coolly. "Funny. I don't see your name on the deed." He handed Richard a folder containing copies of his ownership documents, permits, and evidence of the HOA's illegal actions. "Take a good look. These garages never belonged here." Richard sputtered, clearly caught off guard. Before he could retaliate, police cruisers pulled up to the scene, their lights flashing silently. Officers stepped out, asking questions and assessing the situation. Jonathan anticipated this moment and was prepared. He calmly explained that the garages were built without proper authorization and provided documentation to back up his claims. The officers exchanged glances, clearly unsure how to proceed. By the time night fell again, the final garage came crashing down. Exhausted but triumphant, Jonathan and his crew surveyed their handiwork. Where 12 garages once stood, there was now nothing but empty land, a blank canvas waiting to be reclaimed. For the first time in months, Jonathan felt a sense of peace wash over him. He knew the fight wasn't over. The HOA wouldn't go down without a fight. But tonight, he had won. And that was enough. The morning after the demolition, the neighborhood buzzed with chatter. News of Jonathan's bold move spread like wildfire, and opinions were divided. Some residents admired his courage, seeing him as a modern-day underdog who stood up to the powerful HOA. Others were outraged, calling his actions reckless and dangerous. The HOA board, meanwhile, was in full crisis mode. Richard, the chairman, called an emergency meeting at the community center. Flanked by lawyers and security guards, he paced back and forth, his face red with anger. "This is unacceptable," he barked to the small crowd that had gathered. "Jonathan Hayes has committed an act of vandalism, pure and simple. He cannot be allowed to get away with this." But not everyone agreed. A young woman named Sarah spoke up, her voice steady but firm. "With all due respect, Mr. Chairman, those garages didn't belong there in the first place. You built them without permission, on someone else's property. Maybe it's time we stop pretending you're always right." Her words sparked murmurs of agreement among some attendees, but Richard quickly shut down the discussion. "We will handle this legally," he declared, glaring at anyone who dared challenge him. Behind the scenes, however, panic set in. The evidence Jonathan had collected, the permits, the photos, the outdated zoning laws, was damning. For the first time, the HOA found themselves on shaky ground. Later that day, Richard showed up at Jonathan's property, flanked by 2 burly security guards and a team of lawyers. They marched onto the land as if they owned it, but Jonathan was ready for them. Standing on his porch, arms crossed, he watched them approach with a mixture of amusement and defiance. "What do you want now, Richard?" Jonathan asked, his tone calm but laced with sarcasm. "Come to build more garages." Richard ignored the jab and held out a document. "You've violated multiple ordinances, Mr. Hayes. We demand that you cease and desist immediately, or face the consequences." Jonathan smirked, stepping forward to take the paper. Without even looking at it, he tucked it into his pocket. Then, with deliberate slowness, he pulled out his own folder and handed it to Richard. Inside were copies of every piece of evidence he had gathered. Deeds proving ownership, emails showing the HOA's refusal to negotiate, and expert opinions stating the garages were constructed illegally. "This isn't over," Richard snapped, flipping through the documents. His confidence wavered as he realized how thoroughly Jonathan had prepared. For once, the smug grin was gone from his face. "It should have been over months ago," Jonathan replied evenly. "All you had to do was respect my property. Instead, you chose to bulldoze your way in, literally. Now you can deal with the fallout." Furious but powerless, Richard stormed off, his entourage trailing behind him. As they left, Jonathan turned to see several neighbors watching from a distance. Some nodded approvingly, while others looked uneasy. Wordlessly, he gave them a slight nod before heading back inside. Over the next few days, tension simmered. The HOA issued formal complaints, threatening lawsuits and fines. But Jonathan remained unshaken. He knew the law was on his side, and so did they. Slowly but surely, the HOA began to retreat. Their threats grew quieter, their demands less forceful. It was clear they were trying to save face, but the damage was done. The community had seen their true colors, and many no longer trusted them. One evening, as Jonathan sat on his porch watching the sunset, he reflected on everything that had happened. The battle had been exhausting, both physically and emotionally, but it had also taught him something valuable. Sometimes, standing up for yourself means taking risks. By dismantling the garages, he hadn't just reclaimed his land, he'd reclaimed his dignity. And though the HOA still lingered in the background, they no longer held the same power over him. For now, peace had returned to Jonathan's corner of the world. The air smelled fresher, the stars seemed brighter, and the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain: he would face them head-on, just as he always had. Weeks passed, and life in the neighborhood began to settle into a new rhythm. The 12 garages were gone, leaving behind an open expanse of land that felt like it could breathe again. Jonathan wasted no time transforming the space. He cleared away the last bits of debris, leveled the ground, and planted rows of wildflowers that swayed gently in the breeze. He built a small walking path lined with benches, creating a peaceful spot where he could sit and watch the sunset or listen to birds chirp in the morning. It was his way of reclaiming not just the land, but the serenity that had been stolen from him. The HOA didn't disappear entirely, of course. They still held their meetings and enforced their rules, but there was a noticeable shift in their tone. Gone was the arrogance, replaced by a cautious uneasiness. Richard avoided eye contact with Jonathan whenever they crossed paths, and other board members seemed reluctant to bring up his name. The community had seen how far Jonathan was willing to go to protect what was his, and it made them think twice about crossing him, or anyone else for that matter. Word of Jonathan's victory spread beyond the neighborhood, sparking conversations in nearby towns. Local newspapers ran stories about the garage takedown, as some called it, portraying Jonathan as both a hero and a cautionary tale. People debated whether his actions were justified, but most agreed on one thing. The HOA had overstepped, and someone finally held them accountable. For many residents who had quietly resented the HOA's strict rules, Jonathan became a symbol of resistance, a reminder that standing up to authority wasn't just possible. Sometimes it was necessary. As spring arrived, Jonathan's garden bloomed into a riot of colors. Reds, yellows, purples, all blending together in a vibrant tapestry. Neighbors who once whispered about him now stopped by to admire the transformation. Some even thanked him for standing his ground. "You really showed them," one elderly woman said with a smile as she sat on one of the benches. "We've needed someone like you around here for a long time." Jonathan chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "I didn't do it for attention," he replied. "I just wanted my peace back." But peace wasn't the only thing he gained. Through the ordeal, Jonathan reconnected with old friends who had joined his crew during the demolition. They often gathered at his house for barbecues, sharing laughter and swapping stories about their younger days in construction. These moments reminded him of the importance of community, not the kind enforced by rigid rules, but the kind built on trust, mutual respect, and shared experiences. Still, Jonathan knew the battle wasn't entirely over. The HOA occasionally sent letters reminding him of ongoing legal matters, though nothing ever came of them. He suspected they were bluffing, trying to save face more than anything else. Regardless, Jonathan remained vigilant, keeping copies of every document and staying informed about local zoning laws. If the HOA tried anything again, he'd be ready. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching fireflies dance across the yard, Jonathan reflected on everything he had been through. The fight had tested him in ways he never imagined, pushing him to his limits and forcing him to dig deep for strength he didn't know he had. But it also taught him something important. True freedom wasn't just about owning a piece of land. It was about having the courage to protect it, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. And so, Jonathan Hayes found himself content once more. His sanctuary was restored, his spirit unbroken, and his resolve stronger than ever. As the stars twinkled above, casting a soft glow over his property, he smiled. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew he'd face them with the same determination that had brought him this far. For Jonathan, peace wasn't just a state of mind. It was something earned, something fought for. And he had won.